"We're moving in," my DIL announced about my house. What I did next left everyone speechless. If you had told me 6 months ago that I'd be the villain in my own son's marriage, I would have laughed you out of my kitchen. But that's exactly what I became the moment I refused to hand over the deed to the house I built with my own 2 hands and 40 years of my late husband's sweat. My name is Deborah, I'm 71 years old, and before you decide whether I'm the bad guy in this story, I want you to hear the whole thing, because I promise you, it does not end the way anyone expected. Stick with me to the end because what I did still makes my hands shake a little when I think about it. Before I get into it, if you're the kind of person who believes a woman my age still has some fight left in her, do me a favor and hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and honestly, some nights those comments are the only company I have in this house. Alright, let's get into it. I raised one son. Just one. His name doesn't matter for this story, so I'll just call him my son, and I loved that boy fiercely from the moment they put him in my arms in 1978. His father, my husband, passed 11 years ago from a heart attack that took him in his sleep, quiet as anything, and left me alone in a 4-bedroom house on 2 acres of land that we had paid off, board by board, nail by nail, over 22 years. That house was never just wood and brick to me. It was the place where I learned to be a wife, then a mother, then a widow. Every room had a ghost of a memory in it. The kitchen where I taught my son to crack an egg without getting shell in the bowl. The porch where his father and I sat every single evening after dinner, no matter the weather, just to talk about our day. That house was my whole life folded into 4 walls, and I intended to die in it. My son married about 4 years ago. I'll be honest with you, watching this documentary of my own life, I liked her at first. She was polished, she was ambitious, she worked in something corporate that I never fully understood no matter how many times it was explained to me, and she called me mom from the very first dinner, which touched me more than I let on. For the first year things were fine. A little distant maybe, but fine. She had her career, my son had his job at the plant, and I had my garden and my Thursday bridge club and my quiet Sunday phone calls with my son that slowly over time started happening less and less. The trouble didn't come all at once. Came the way water gets into a foundation, slow, quiet, until one day you notice the whole structure is compromised. Started with little comments. "This house is so big for just one person, Mom. You know, with property taxes the way they are, it doesn't make financial sense for you to stay here alone. Have you thought about what happens to the house when you're gone?" Every comment sounded reasonable on its own. Together they sounded like a plan. I should have seen it sooner. I really should have. But here's the thing about being a mother. You want so badly to believe your child has your best interest at heart that you talk yourself out of your own good instincts. I told myself she was just being practical. I told myself my son would never let anyone push me out of my own home. I was wrong on both counts, and I found that out on a Tuesday evening in March, when they showed up at my door unannounced with a bottle of wine and smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. We sat in my living room, the same living room where my husband and I had put up a Christmas tree every year for 2 decades, and my daughter-in-law set down her wine glass and said, as casually as if she were telling me the weather forecast, "We've been talking, and we think it makes the most sense for us to move in with you. We'll help with the bills, we'll take care of the property, and honestly, Mom, it's silly for you to rattle around in this big house by yourself when we could all be together." Then she smiled, reached over, and patted my hand like I was a child being told a bedtime story. "We're moving in," she said. "Not would you consider it? Not what do you think? We're moving in." I looked at my son, waiting for him to say something, anything, that indicated this wasn't already decided. He wouldn't meet my eyes. That told me everything. This wasn't a conversation. This was an announcement. Over the next few weeks, I learned just how far along their plan already was. My daughter-in-law had been quietly looking into what it would take to have the deed transferred into a trust with my son as trustee, for tax purposes, she said, and to protect the house in case something happened to me. She had already spoken to a realtor about what the property might sell for eventually. She had already picked out which room would become her home office. She talked about renovating my kitchen, the kitchen where I taught my son to crack eggs, into an open concept space with an island, as though 40 years of memory could just be knocked down along with a wall. I want you to understand something about me before I go further. I am not a pushover, but I am also not a cruel woman. I did not raise my son to fight with him. I have never once in my life wanted to be the reason a family falls apart. But there is a difference between being agreeable and being erased, and I realized somewhere in those weeks that I was being erased from my own life, one polite little conversation at a time. So I did something my daughter-in-law never saw coming. I got quiet. If you've ever dealt with someone who mistakes kindness for weakness, you know that silence unnerves them more than any argument ever could. I stopped pushing back in conversation. I stopped raising objections. I smiled, I nodded, I said things like "we'll see" and "let me think about it," and I let her believe she had already won. Meanwhile, I picked up the phone and called someone I hadn't spoken to in almost a decade. My late husband's cousin, who happens to be an estate attorney 2 counties over. I told her everything, start to finish, no exaggeration, no drama, just the plain facts. And she told me something that I now consider one of the most important sentences anyone has ever said to me. She said, "Deborah, nothing happens to that house unless you sign something. As long as you don't sign anything, you are in complete control." That sentence changed everything for me. I had spent weeks feeling like a leaf being carried along by a current I couldn't fight. In that one phone call, I remembered I was the one holding the deed the entire time. If you've ever felt like your own family was trying to make decisions about your life without actually asking you, go ahead and drop a comment letting me know, because I have a feeling I'm not the only woman this has happened to, and I want us to find each other in this comment section tonight. Over the following month, I quietly did 4 things. First, I had my attorney draw up an irrevocable trust of my own, one that named a very specific set of terms about who could live in the house, under what conditions, and what would happen if anyone tried to pressure a transfer of the deed while I was alive. Second, I had a home security system installed, cameras included, under the very reasonable explanation to my son that a woman living alone should be careful, which nobody could argue with. Third, I began keeping a written journal dated, detailed of every conversation, every comment about the house, every mention of moving in, renovating, or transferring ownership. And fourth, and this is the part that still gives me a little thrill when I think about it, I invited them both over for Sunday dinner the same way we'd done 100 times before, and I let them believe I was ready to talk logistics about the move. They arrived Sunday at 5, my daughter-in-law practically glowing, already talking about paint swatches before she'd even taken her coat off. My son looked nervous in a way that told me he knew, somewhere deep down, that this whole thing was wrong, but he'd let his wife's momentum carry him along anyway, the same way water carries a stick downstream whether the stick wants to go or not. We sat down to the pot roast I'd made, and my daughter-in-law started right in about the timeline. We were thinking we could start moving boxes in by next month, she said, cutting into her food without looking up. And we already spoke to a contractor about the kitchen. I let her finish. I let her get every single detail out onto the table before I said a word. Then I set down my fork, folded my hands, and said, "Before we go any further, I think there's something you both should see." I walked to the hallway closet, pulled out a folder I had prepared, and set it in front of them. Inside was a copy of the trust document my attorney had drawn up, notarized and filed, clearly stating that the house was protected under terms that could not be altered, transferred, or renovated without my sole written consent, and that any attempt to pressure, coerce, or manipulate me into transferring ownership would trigger a clause disinheriting the responsible party from any future claim to the estate entirely. I also placed beside it my journal, dated and detailed, documenting every single conversation about the house from the very first "this place is so big" for one person comment onward. The silence in that room was the loudest silence I have ever heard in my life. My daughter-in-law's face went through about 4 different expressions in the space of 10 seconds, confusion, disbelief, something like anger, and then finally, the dawning realization that the sweet, agreeable old woman she thought she was dealing with had been 3 steps ahead of her the entire time. My son just stared at the folder like it was a stranger sitting at our dinner table. I spoke calmly. "I want you to know that because I think it matters." I did not raise my voice. I did not call anyone names. I simply said, "I love you both and I have loved having you in my life. But this house is not a retirement gift I'm handing over, because it's convenient for someone else's 5-year plan. This house is mine. It will remain mine for as long as I am alive, and what happens to it after that is entirely my decision, made on my own timeline with my own lawyer and no one else's input. I am not moving out. Nobody is moving in. And if either of you ever again speaks to me about transferring this deed, renovating this kitchen, or helping me by taking control of anything I own, that clause you just read about disinheritance stops being theoretical." My daughter-in-law tried to recover. She always was quick on her feet, I'll give her that. She started talking about how she just wanted to help and how I was misunderstanding her intentions. But intentions don't show up in writing, and I had 6 weeks of dated, detailed conversations that told a very different story than the one she was suddenly trying to tell. My son didn't say much that night. He looked, honestly, like a man who had just woken up from a fog he didn't know he'd been standing in. Later that week, he called me alone without her, and apologized in a way that felt real. He admitted he'd let things go further than he was comfortable with, because keeping the peace at home felt easier than pushing back. I understood that more than he probably realized. I told him I loved him and that the door to this house, my house, would always be open to him, just him, whenever he wanted to visit. Just not as an entitlement. As a gift I chose to give. It's been 4 months since that dinner. My daughter-in-law and I have spoken exactly twice, both times brief and cordial, both times with a wall between us that I don't think will ever fully come down, and honestly, I've made peace with that. My son visits every other Sunday now, sometimes with her, sometimes without, and we've settled into something that feels less like a family being held together by obligation and more like people choosing each other, imperfectly, on their own terms. As for the house, it's still mine. Every board, every nail, every ghost of a memory in every room. The kitchen where I taught my son to crack an egg still has the same counters we installed in 1998. Nobody's knocking down that wall. Not while I'm alive to stop them, and thanks to that trust, not for a good while after that either. I think about that Tuesday evening a lot, the one where she sat in my living room and said we're moving in like it was already settled, like my whole life was a formality waiting to be finalized. I think about how close I came to just going along with it because I didn't want to be difficult, because I didn't want to be the mother-in-law who caused problems, because for a few weeks I genuinely believed that keeping the peace meant giving up my own home. I'm so grateful I didn't stay quiet for good. I got loud in exactly the way that mattered, at exactly the right moment, in front of exactly the right people, with paper in my hand instead of just words in the air. If there's one thing I want any woman watching this to take away from my story, it's this: being agreeable is not the same as being powerless, and silence, used the right way at the right time, can be the sharpest tool you own. Nobody gets to announce what happens to your life, your home, or your legacy as though your opinion is optional. You get to decide. Always. No matter how old you are, no matter how tired you are of the conflict, no matter how much you love the people trying to talk you out of your own house. If this story meant something to you tonight, I would be so grateful if you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because I have quite a few more of these stories to tell you, and I have a feeling some of you have stories of your own sitting in that comment section right now just waiting to be told. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if anything in tonight's story felt familiar to your own life, and I will see every single one of you in the comments. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of your homes. Nobody else is going to do it for you.